What's going on, y'all? KMBest here. Let's take a look at the best decks to climb in Marvel Snap. First up on the list is Bounce, and I think this deck has a fair claim to being the absolute best deck in the game, with massive point output, as you can see from the way the deck is built, and a relevant Shadow King to damage all of those decks looking to leverage cards like Symbiote Spider-Man, or Deadpool, or any of the move cards that gain green power. There is a lot that Shadow King hits right now. This deck is benefiting from a couple of metagame changes that may not directly be related to card power, but instead the perception of card power. Before the patch, Hela was by far the most played deck by every measure we had at nearly every level of the game. After the patch, that is not true. This allows space for a deck like this, which is leveraging a card, Shadow King, that is very bad into Hela, to exist and to be reasonably called the best deck or a top metagame deck, while it is still having probably slightly less point output and no real clog tools against that matchup. That's not to say you're never going to beat Hela, but if you see a Hell Cow, it ends up getting a little bit fraught very fast. This deck does have some pretty massive point output. It's able to go pound for pound on points with pretty much any deck in the game, and the ones that are able to meet it and sort of go power for power are typically weaker to Shadow King, with the notable exception of the Cosmo and Alioth move deck, which honestly is dropping both in play rate and in win rate. In other words, the perfect storm has sort of arisen for this deck to actually make sense and be a powerful part of this current metagame. This list is built very much for points. Typically, if you're missing one of the points cards, you can replace it with something like a US Agent and still attempt to be a points deck. But if you're missing two of the points cards, you have to look a different direction in terms of how you want to build your bounce list. This list is playing the absolute minimal interaction and the absolute maximal point output. If you are unable to replicate that with your collection, you will have to look a different direction. I've been down on Wiccan decks in recent weeks, and it should be no surprise why, because you've probably heard this spiel before if you've ever watched my channel, but if you haven't, here you go, just in case, welcome to the channel. Here's why I've been down on Wiccan decks. They don't have enough points. The one Wiccan deck that I've been able to feel like actually has enough points is Afflict-Can here, and that's because it gets so much more out of a 2-drop like US Agent, out of a 4-drop like Man-Thing. It is actually able to put big numbers on the board with those cards instead of being relegated to the only real point threats in the deck being Alioth and Magneto. That's simply not up to snuff in the current metagame. But this deck is going to be able to handle a lot more of what the metagame throws at you. As far as Wiccan decks go, if you want to play a traditional version of the Wiccan deck, i.e. one of those decks with a bunch of 1-drops in it, and then something big at the end, I personally advise that this version is the best one that I've played by a decent margin. I have not had any luck with other Wiccan variants. They have all ended up very awkward for me, and that is a genuinely sad thing, but it does represent a sort of changing of the guard in the metagame in terms of what matters. Where Wiccan decks fall short isn't just in power, it's typically in interaction as well. It's hard to create a Wiccan deck that is able to play Shang-Chi and Shadow King, two cards that are incredibly relevant and powerful in this metagame. For this reason, you end up with this being the best Wiccan deck, in my opinion, by far. Now, many people are already familiar with Hela. A lot of people stopped playing it after the nerf. In my opinion, the nerf was not a particularly meaningful one, and this deck will remain powerful and potent throughout the remainder of its lifespan, as long as it has a similar shape to what it is right now. I think this deck is honestly a little bit underrated right now. Like, everyone who was playing a ton of it has moved off of it, and that seems kind of crazy to me because it has changed maybe 1%. And people who were already playing it, I don't really see why they would be switching off of it. It doesn't make any sense to me. This is a perfectly fine deck that has not a lot of very fine decision points, a lot of RNG in it. It's exactly the same as it was in terms of the value proposition that it offers. It's just a little bit more reliant on having Loot Cage, but otherwise the deck plays the same and has similar numbers, and the metagame is less prepared for it. And I think that, that kind of dynamic, the fact that this nerf managed to push people away from playing this deck, even though it is kind of the same value prop that it always was, is a little bit interesting to me. I think part of it is that the value proposition of Hela was always a little bit lower than people acted like it was. It was a very strong deck, but it wasn't like, oh my god, busted. It was just very strong in a very not very fun way. And it's still very strong in a very not very fun way. So if you're looking to not pay attention, you can absolutely still play this deck. You can play a ton of this deck. There is nothing wrong with it. I had great success when I played this deck. It's totally fine right now. And I think that a lot of people who were scared off of it should not have been scared off of it. You can absolutely feel free to whip out the Hell Cow into Galacombo and go to town. The deck has even become more and more refined, honestly. This is, like, to me, very clearly the best version of it, instead of playing Wasp or Giganto in the place of Luke Cage or, of course, Red Hulk in here. I think you want to play this. I'm not saying you need to go out and get Red Hulk to do it, but the change in the dynamic that has allowed Red Hulk to be discarded on turn 6 with a Hell Cow, as opposed to just sitting in your hand and not finding a good way to discard it in the older builds, has made Red Hulk, in my opinion, a little bit more valuable than Giganto. It's been a solid card in this list for me. On the whole, the deck is functionally the same. Everyone who was complaining about it, I don't even know if you got your wish. People stopped playing it. Maybe you did get your wish, but this deck is still strong. Now we're getting well into the range of scams. This is a pure scam War Machine deck that I really appreciate because it snowballs very effectively. Jubilee and Iron Lad are great ways at getting re-rolls on your War Machine or Legion. Once you have the Storm down, basically everything flows from there, but it is a little bit reliant on actually getting that Storm down, and if you aren't doing that, you aren't really doing what this deck wants to do. This is a little bit of an all or nothing type of build. It needs to do the Storm into the 4-drop, and if it doesn't do that, it usually ends up feeling very awkward, but when you pull that off, it's just very hard for you to lose. When you get a War Machine down, you can either win that Storm lane on the back end and then just drop an Infinite, or you can win a Storm lane on the back end with something like a Dr. Doom, who, by the way, is probably the weakest card in this deck in my experience. The interesting thing about this is how good Madam Web felt to me, because this card just provides so much flexibility, so much ability to make sure that you are ahead by the amount you need to be in all of the lanes you need to be. And also the fact that you are able to use Blink to just like go tutor up specific stuff. You'll notice that other than the Storm, like there's not actually a 3 in the deck. So if you have a 2, you're gonna go up to 4, or a chance to get that War Machine, a chance to get that Dr. Doom, a chance to get all this big stuff. And that is also true of the 1s, right? And that comes with upsides and downsides, right? Yes, I have won games where I have blinked a Nebula into the Infinite. That's awesome. But also, it means that when you draw stuff in the wrong order, as is common with blink decks, your bad hands are really bad. Your good hands are amazing and borderline unbeatable, though, and that's what you're really going for with this deck. You're trying to optimize the messed up stuff that this archetype can do. In terms of hybridization in this shell, I still believe that the Fruit Punch deck is about as good as you're going to get. I do think that you can try replacing Scarlet Spider with the old Jeff that people were running, or with something along the lines of a Captain Marvel. I definitely think there's still growth to be had in this hybridization. But I also feel like if you are a move deck right now, you're benefiting from this being a Storm deck as well. Because of the amount of Shadow King running around, you actually kind of want to get your move stuff into a lane that actually protects it. So there's synergies happening both ways here. Madam Web is great with your Storm, and your move stuff can actually be protected in a Storm lane so it doesn't get Shadow Kinged. Meanwhile, you can drop an Infinite somewhere else once you play a War Machine. This should not be a surprise to people who have been watching these videos for a while. I think this is the 3rd tier list that this is shown up on. It's a very solid deck. It is perfectly functional. And I think of the move decks, not necessarily the best of them, but the one that I feel the most comfortable with right now. One of the things about the move decks that I think is really striking to me is how hard they are to play. There is a big delta between how good these cards are and how good these decks are at the very, very high end of Infinite. Like I'm talking the top 1% of the top 10% here. than there is even in top 10%. What I mean by this, you can see from the deck name. This deck is good, but even in top 10% Infinite, it has a fairly mediocre win rate because it is so damn hard to play. You have to make so many reads. You have to know exactly what your opponent is doing. You have to prepare your setup for whatever it is that you're going to be doing. You have to know on like turn 3 or 4 what your end game is, visualize it, and work all the way towards it. So the better you are, the better this deck is. But honestly, it's a very scary proposition to play, in my humble opinion. This deck has so many decision points and so many ways to mess up, and you will spend so much of your time thinking, oh, I could have won if I did this, and this differently. And you'll be right, but you also might overreact to that, and you'll be like, oh, next time I would have won that last game, and they will be wrong this time. There has not been a more context and play opponent reliant deck in this game for a very long time. So I say this not to say that you shouldn't play this deck, but that if you do, please make sure that you're like very practiced with it, that you've put the work in, because it is good. There are real upsides here. Being a Cosmo Alioth deck makes you absolutely dunk on the bounce decks. That's a really good thing to do. But you still end up in so many awkward spots where like you lose because you moved the wrong thing with Madam Web 2 turns ago. Stuff like that happens a lot in this deck, and it is very difficult to play. All right, it's time to talk about everyone's other least favorite archetype, Clog. This is the generic list. I personally prefer both of the alternate lists, but I think this is a good option that is very hard for me to argue against in any meaningful way. I can argue that maybe you'll get like a marginal upgrade by playing a different list, but I can't really argue that this list is a bad choice in any way. It is doing something that is very powerful. It is doing something that is very straightforward, although I think not straightforward enough. And I really wanted to use this platform because these are the videos of mine that typically get the most views. I wanted to use this platform to really get something straight about how these decks have to play. You don't really want to be clogging until they've played a couple cards in the lane. When you're clogging early, that's a little bit risky for you because those clogs are much better after they've played a couple small dudes. Once there's like 2 small dudes in a lane, play 2 clogs in that lane, go to town. That's how you want to play this deck. I still see too many people just curving out White Widow and Green Goblin, and that's not what you want to be doing with any of these. So keep that in mind with every clog deck I talk about. Please don't just play them like curve decks. They are more than that. The most important thing you can do is fill up a lane. It doesn't matter if you're playing off curve if you get that done because of how strong Cannonball can be. Now, you know me, if there's a tempo hybrid, I'm basically always going to prefer that as my method of clog. This is my favorite clog deck and my favorite Thena deck right now. Just a very solid, strong, powerful output deck that does a lot of the things you want to be doing in this metagame, is not reliant on magic in the same way, and can output points in a powerful way. This deck does damage. It's great at clogging because of the addition, like the fact that we have all this stuff like debris into 2 clogs on turn 4, just absolutely unbelievable. We get reasonable stats out of our Thena. We have Kitty Pride. We have Cannonball. My deck building style is typically to strip things down to the bare essentials, and that is what I feel this deck has accomplished. The only card in this deck that I'm not 100% sure that I love is Dr. Octopus, but frankly, I've just enjoyed having a 4/8 that clogs. I don't really hate that much. I'm pretty much fine with it most of the time, and I can see some experimentation being useful there, but I haven't really found a better replacement yet. The drink is the other version of Tempo Clog. I personally prefer the Thena version right now. I think it's a little bit less vulnerable in terms of the point output. 2 cards like Shadow King, I also think it's a little bit more consistent in terms of getting to that point output, but this is a perfectly fine deck. I think you should look at it as very similar to Tempo Clog, just with a different points package as your early game. Goon Knight has been in and out of tier lists, and I do think that it's interesting that it's seeing a bit of a resurgence. I played this for like 20 games. It was 21 games. I went 12-9. It was like perfectly fine. It's far from a deck I would recommend as like the best option possible, but it's a totally acceptable functional version of this if you really want to be doing it. I am genuinely a little bit surprised that this deck has managed to be successful and Agatha hasn't. When you look at the stats, I can't think of a good reason for that to happen other than the importance of the disruption in this deck, because Agatha does numbers better, but it's not going to be enough for you to beat a bounce deck anyway. So this deck takes it and says, all right, well, I'm not going to beat the bounce deck on numbers, even if I am going to be the Agatha deck. What I'm going to do instead is try to have more disruption. I have rocks, I have Spider Ham, I have multiple discards. Like, you have this as your strategy, where I think in previous metagames, going for the pure point potential was worthwhile. In a metagame where people are playing bounce, where people are playing Hela, where people are playing any of the decks we talked about, Agatha just gets outpowered, while this deck can try to drag them down to its level. It's still a little bit clunky, don't get me wrong, but there is some reasonable upside in this list. Pure Affliction is actually still a perfectly functional mid-range deck. There is absolutely nothing wrong with choosing to play a mid-range deck in this kind of metagame. There's just a lot you can do with tech cards and reasonable points. This deck has tech cards and reasonable points, and that's really all you can ask from it. There is a notable downturn in Hela, which means a notable upturn in the amount of decks that are not playing Luke Cage, which is good for you. The bad part for you is that the more people pick up the Afflict-Can deck, the more you're going to be really worried, because you don't really beat the card Luke Cage. You don't have a serious option into that card, and that is a very unfortunate circumstance for you to find yourself in. You don't want to be sitting there playing a deck that is fully reliant on Affliction when your opponent is able to play Luke Cage. You just don't want to be doing that, and between Hela and the Afflict-Can decks, there is some notable worry that there's gonna be some Luke Caging in matchups where you don't expect it necessarily. I am someone who really enjoys playing Arishem when I can. I'm a big fan of the card. I'm a big fan of the deck. I'm a big fan of... I enjoy it. I have fun. I have had success with basically every deck we've talked about so far. I have had almost no success with Arishem post-patch. I've gotten very much nowhere. Like, I feel as though this deck is just in a very awkward position, not really able to output the points that it needs to. You're a blob deck and everyone is playing Shadow King. The bounce decks are going over the top of you. Sometimes the Hela decks are going over the top of you. You have this inherent, like, some of your games are just losses because of the way you draw sometimes. It does not feel like the risk reward here is worth it. I think Arishem is fine, but of these decks, I think this is about as low as I've had him in a while. We've talked a lot about point output and Shadow King and things like that. This deck has a nut draw that leaves you with 1,000,000 points and totally immune to Shadow King. And that's a reason enough to play it, honestly. This is a deck that is really aimed at attempting to beast up your one-cost cards, like Human Torch, Iron Fist, Ghost Spider, play them all on the final turn of the game, then play a gigantic Living Tribunal, and just generally have as many points as you possibly can on the board. It's strong. This is a strong deck. It's not necessarily the most hidden of tech, but people will still not always expect a Living Tribunal to be able to win you the lanes that it can win you. This is a deck that has a very defined, like, flowchart style to it most of the time, but it doesn't have to. When you're not flowcharting in the perfect way, i.e. beasting up those 1-drops into dropping a Living Tribunal and a bunch of free 1-drops, you are also going to be able to play the role of a relatively normal move deck a decent amount of the time. Hercules getting buffed is actually something you care about because you need those extra stats really, really badly, but you should be very, very wary of cards like Shadow King and Shang-Chi, which are as good right now as I think they've ever been. I am still on the full stats version of Destroy when this deck shows up, and I do think it is a good deck, or a good enough deck, that it's worth talking about here. Destroy is just good at doing numbers. It does numbers very, very well, and its Deadpool draws are very, very hard for any other deck to beat. If you get Deadpool and X23 and some stuff to keep blowing them up, you are almost certainly going to win the game. It's a straightforward, simple, and relatively cheap deck. I will mention, if you don't have Aranya, feel free to replace it with something like Arnim Zola or Shang-Chi. The same actually goes for Hulkbuster. The reason both of them are in here, though, is basically so we can make the Deadpool as big as possible. at a moment's notice. Our job is Big Deadpool, that is what we are trying to do, and then once we have made that, we will go on and use that to snowball into a Big Venom, into a Big Null, into a cheap Death. All of that stuff comes with it, but first, Big Deadpool is the order of the day. While we're talking about traditionally strong decks that are actually pretty good right now, Zoo got a nerf and suddenly everyone stopped playing it like it wasn't good. I have no idea why. This deck is perfectly fine. You will be doing all the same things you were always doing. It was a 1-point nerf on Marvel Boy, people. Come on. This deck is exactly as good as it has always been. You have your 1 flex slot in this metagame. It's being used on Cosmo because you want to be able to beat the bounce decks on it, but this deck is perfectly fine. Perfectly acceptable. If you run into a bunch of Killmongers, make the Cosmo Chimera. You can do whatever you want with this list. The point output is so strong, and the customization you can do, I think people really underrate this deck. I think even having it this far into the video might be underrating it. Like, this is just a classically strong and good deck. You can have Cosmo, Shadow King, or Chimera. Do whatever you want in this. I will also note that basically every week I've just changed one drop in there. That one has Silver Sable in it, but it could be Hydra Bob, it could be Nightcrawler, it could be whatever. You don't really have to like, oh, I don't have Silver Sable, I can't play this deck. That's ridiculous. It's pretty much like any one drop. Nico, go play that. You're fine. Like, this is not a thing that's worth stressing about. I've just seen more people playing Silver Sable recently, so that's what's in there. Because there are less Helas in the metagame and more people are messing around with what you might describe as more mid-rangey strategies, I think I'm back on Nimrod PF as the way I would like to go about it, but frankly, I don't think this deck is a very good choice right now. I think probably the #1 card we've talked about during this whole video has been the card Shadow King. That's a really good card against Phoenix Force, and you need to be prepared to beat it out of a lot of stuff, and you're probably not going to beat it out of a bounce deck basically ever, no matter what you're doing. And that is a genuine issue that this archetype has. It feels like the meta's been ping-ponging between decks that go taller than this, and decks that play Shadow King and can beat this, and that's just left poor Phoenix Force in a spot where it's good, but I can't necessarily say I'd rather play it than something like Hela, which has a lot of the same dynamics in terms of going over the top of mid-range decks. We are now into the Wild Boy section of the video. This deck was cooked up by TLSG. I actually did a video on it yesterday. It's a very surprising and strong take on the Wiccan archetype, but ultimately I do think it falls more into the wacky and fun and playable rather than meta-breaking and unbelievable. It is definitely good enough to play. I'm not going to sit here and say that it's not. It's even doing some genuinely smart stuff with Psylocke and Zabu, but the more people play against it, the more they get used to how it works. They start realizing, oh, they missed their Wiccan curve. They had a Psylocke into nothing. It's time to snap them and start bullying them out of here. And that's where the deck falls short. It's very good as long as people haven't picked up on the weak spots in it. But once people have started picking up on the weak spots, and believe me, they have, suddenly you're getting bully snapped with some very unfunctional hands a lot of the time, and you have to make some very tough decisions very early. That's not a great spot for a deck that really wants to have surprise on its side. And that leaves it as a sort of wacky alternative rather than as one of the better decks in the game. A bunch of my friends have been playing this deck. I believe Prodigy was the person who cooked it up. It is just a pure stats and SK deck. Like, we've talked so much about the role of Shadow King. We play Shadow King to beat the move decks. We need Shadow King and then we have other stats. That's what this deck is. It's stats and Shadow King. That's really all that's happening here. There's a lot of window dressing on here. Believe me, I know. But what's happening is just we're trying to get as many stats on the board as we can, and then we're trying to have Shadow King for any decks that can get more stats on the board than us. The Pixie stuff is pretty cool when it works. You can get a cheap She-Hulk and then float only a little bit, and that's awesome when you can pull that off. You can get a cheap Infinite and skip into that. That's awesome when you can pull that off. Like, there's some cool stuff that the Pixie allows, but this is fundamentally just stats and SK, and it is sort of my opinion at this point that the Bounce deck does stats and SK just a little bit better, unless this deck is purely nutting off, and definitely more consistently in my experience. This list is kind of another stats and SK deck, but it's actually like even kind of simpler than that, okay? It's stats and SK, but also it's Killmonger, so you don't instantly lose to Clog, right? And that's actually kind of like, what's fascinating to me about this deck is just how straightforward the deck building is here, where it's like, okay, we want to be a stats and SK deck, that way we beat the move decks. What if we are also a stats and SK deck that beats the Clog decks, so we get to put the DeathBird stuff back in here. We get to go as big as possible, because otherwise we are the most dead to Clog of anyone ever. You just get absolutely obliterated when you're trying to play a Mysterio and a Squirrel Girl deck in a world where people are doing, you know, turn 4 Titania Goblin. You just don't actually have the ability to beat that. And so you end up with a deck like this instead, which is just numbers, and you have some outs to the cards that people are going to snap you about, and because you have those outs, you can then turn those snaps back on them. A bunch of my friends have been playing this deck, and it's gotten to the point where the only cards in tier A on Untapped are cards from this deck, Bucky Barnes and Angel, and I don't want to be too down on it. That is an incredibly funny accomplishment to have, but it is like a bunch of people like Woody and Butt, like really great players have been playing this. And I think the deck is fine, but I think more than anything else, it exemplifies where the metagame is at. Because what this deck is doing is reasonable stats, Shang Shadow King. That's what's happening here. It's a deck that is leaning on Shang and Shadow King, and then an unpredictable method of putting up a reasonable number of stats to go alongside those cards. You are playing a classic old school mid-range deck here. And this is where it really appeals to me, because I swear, like, give or take a couple of cards that have come out recently, I played a deck like this in the beta. Like, it's just perfect. But more than anything else, it represents what this metagame has become rotated around. And that is the power of these tech cards against the Madam Web decks. That stuff cannot be overstated. It's just very, very good. This deck has Shang and Shadow King and Killmonger. If anything, it's more similar to a Sarah Tech deck than it is to anything else. That's really what's going on here. It's like Sarah Tech without the Sarah. It's just trying to have relevant cards in all the matchups while the rest of the deck chugs along and puts stats on the board. And I think that's really interesting. All right, y'all. Thank you so much. As always, I have been KMBest, and you have been phenomenal. I will see you in the next one. Remember to like and subscribe. Have a good one.